Sardak Nor's forces had been all but wiped out in a deadly war against the necrovirus, Minister Tau knew it was time to go on the offensive. A fleet was sent out to land more than 1 million soldiers divided between the worlds of Sieg and Craig. Sieg is a world covered in frozen, cesium-laced oceans. Archives buried deep beneath the surface use the cold to preserve the relics and operate massive computers. It was decided that since the invasion of Sieg wasn't going to be aided by mechanized units, that Master Technician Evelyn DeLewis should be placed in charge to give the Federation forces an extra edge. Federation forces had a 2-to-1 numerical advantage against their opponents. Several military leaders urged Tau not to divide his landing forces between 2 different worlds, but Tau wanted victory now and had grown confident in the Federation's infantry. The initial landing of Sieg was a disaster. The assault was overly aggressive and Federation forces attempted to land dangerously close to enemy positions. Many landing craft were shot down before ever reaching planetside. By the time Federation forces had established themselves, they were down to almost 50% effective strength. Without the aid of orbital bombardment or armored divisions, the Federation forces suddenly found themselves on the defensive. The Sardak troops launched a massive counterattack along all fronts. Within a short time, the Federation invasion had been completely repelled. Meanwhile, the invasion of Craig was already underway. Craig was a heavily irradiated world known only for its dust mines. Recently, a massive tomb of dormant titans was discovered in the southern hemisphere. Due to careful maneuvering and the use of electronic warfare, the planetary defense systems were largely ineffective. The defenders stayed dug in for months and carried out a number of bold raids against Federation positions. Federation casualties were extreme, but the Sardak ultimately had no way to stop the advanced Federation mechs from blitzing through their positions. The Sardak forces drew the conflict out as long as they could, never surrendering, taking many human lives before the planet was successfully taken. Reception of the operation drew mixed opinions in the Federation. Tau swore he would never again underestimate the strength of an opponent. Knowing that this sudden offensive by the Federation would draw the attention of other factions, it was decided to increase military spending to defend against would-be attackers. Additional ground forces were trained to replace the heavy losses against the Sardak. A pair of massive battleships would join the SS Detroit to form the core of a secondary Federation fleet. To further entrench themselves, the Federation developed a new planetary defensive weaponry that had the capability to fire into deep space, potentially stopping an attacker before they even made it into the system. The new PDS weapons could also be used offensively, as a sort of interstellar artillery system. The Federation was starting to emerge as the clear winner in the galactic race to power. In addition to still holding Mechatol Rex, the advanced starships and weapons possessed by the Federation were a common topic of discussion among the other factions in the galaxy. Part 6, Years 11 and 12 of the Tau Administration. An emergency troop deployment was ordered on Craig. These troops would be necessary to keep a strong presence on the front against the Sardak. As promised when the Sardak first landed there, Freya was going to be invaded. Although the fight against the enemy ships seemed dicey at first due to the Sardak's ferocity even against unfavorable odds, the invasion itself was a complete success. There was nothing the Sardak could do on the ground once the Federation mechs started landing. The entire planet was taken in a month. Freya is a brutally cold ice world populated by only a few scattered mining camps. Despite the brutal climate, it is highly prized for its deposit of rare ores used in starship drives. In another part of space, the Nazroka Alliance were continuing to very quietly gain power. Many began to see them as a preferential option to the Federation as leaders of a new empire. Their plans to focus in a few areas of research, rather than spread out their scientists, was working very well for them. Of course, the real measure of any faction's worth is the happiness and prosperity of its citizens. With all the war and expansion happening across the galaxy, were civilian economies beginning to suffer? It was decided that for the benefit of all who live in the galaxy, a Minister of Commerce be elected, to keep trade prosperous and the galactic economy strong. There was much debate as to who should be trusted with these duties, but there was a common slogan that went something to the effect of, "Anyone but the Federation." After a few deals, bribes, and promises had been made, it was agreed that the Naz Roka be trusted with this important appointment. It was also decided that for the good of everyone, research be shared. It would ultimately be to everyone's benefit if the factions' scientific communities cooperated with each other. But trust was hard to come by, and secrets were guarded closely. The law was voted down. Unfortunately, this did in fact hinder the progress of all factions during the next few years. Though there was one faction that did in fact come out ahead with this vote. The universities of Jalnar were happy to keep their superior technology away from their rivals. The Federation of Sol could feel its dominance in the galaxy coming to be. Minister Tau knew he had to continue his efforts to establish the legitimacy of the Federation to lead this new empire. Though Mechatol Rex was not currently being threatened, Minister Tau knew that this could change in a heartbeat. Planetary defensive weapons, including anti-bombardment shields, were constructed around Federation colonies and strongpoints. Despite the defeat on Sieg, the Federation attempted another high-risk assault, this time on the world of Starpoint. Starpoint was a fortress, and the Federation knew they would need a bit of luck to pull this off. Unfortunately, the invasion was a total failure. Most of the Federation forces were repelled within days of their first landings. With the heavy network of planetary defense weapons, there were few safe landing zones for Federation troops. This allowed the Sardak garrison to react effectively and strike at the landing zones aggressively. After the attack had been repelled, it was reported that the Sardak had suffered almost no casualties. It was another glaring failure for Minister Tau and Evelyn de Lewis. The Federation decided to end their offensive military operations and dig in. They bolstered their infrastructure and supply lines. There was no need for further expansion, and the Sardak were not really a threat, as their conflict against the Necrovirus continued to go very poorly for them. Part of the failure of the Federation's operations against the Sardak was blamed on the fact that while the fleet was highly advanced, research and development into ground warfare had been largely neglected. The AI development algorithm assisted in the new infantry technology program. Weapons, communications, body armor, and even tactics had been developed and improved. Now the Federation had the most advanced infantry in the galaxy, and they would put them to the test very soon. A second invasion of Sieg was ordered. Besides deploying new technology, the Federation also used an overwhelming force to guarantee victory this time. The weakened Sardak defenders put up a token resistance but fell quickly. Even without the Federation's new weapons, the invasion would not have lasted long. The Federation's future was becoming more certain now. They had held Rex during almost the entire conflict and now used unprecedented spending to issue a golden age for their citizens. Even the poorest humans lived a life of luxury compared to most citizens of the galaxy. The humans were not the only ones making big plans, however. The Nazroka Alliance had achieved another milestone industrially, and in response to the Federation's civil spending, also began heavily investing in their people's well-being. Although the Federation of Sol and the Nazroka Alliance were tied for supremacy as far as most were concerned, it was clear the tie would not last. The Federation's victory was inevitable, and no one could stop it at this point. The other factions of the galaxy decided it was best to concede rather than risk further conflict. The Federation of Sol took its rightful place as leader of this new, mighty empire.